So you have people in Hong Kong who have tasted freedom. They understand what freedom is, and of course, because they're so close to the mainland, they know exactly what's happening there, like all the things I talked to you about, like Xinjiang, nobody has freedom of speech, these types of things. They understand the Chinese way of life, and they also understand that if they don't do something about it, this will become the Hong Kong way of life eventually.
Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Philipp. Today we have with us Paul Greaney. He's a reporter with our sister media, NDT Television. Paul, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thanks so much, Josh. Great to be here.
Thank you. Yeah. So Paul just got back from Hong Kong. He was our correspondent there. You might have seen one of our interviews from Hong Kong recently. That was Paul's doing. Paul, one of the first things I want to talk about is how is the scale? I mean, these protests started a long time ago. We're not hearing as much from them, but I understand from your reporting that it still seems to have a lot of energy behind it. Would you say, how would you say the energy has changed and the scale has changed from when they first started?
One of the things that really shocked me when I got there was that what we see on the media is that it's these very violent frontline protests that are just happening sporadically and kind of unorganized or uncontrolled, this type of thing. But when I got to Hong Kong, very quickly I realized that the spirit of protest and the spirit of resistance there isn't just with these black-clad protesters on the front lines. Really, Hong Kong is now divided into what's called blue and yellow. Blue is the people who, a lot of them come from mainland China originally. They align with Beijing. They're very pro-Chinese Communist Party, pro-unification with the mainland. These are called the blue community, for want of a better word. Then you have the yellow community, or the yellow people. And these are the people who prefer to have this firewall between mainland China and Hong Kong. And these are people who are really afraid of losing their freedoms to the totalitarian regime on the mainland. And they've seen these, a lot of them who I've spoken with, like the interview with Mr. Leung that we did together, they've seen these freedoms that they enjoy, these liberal democratic values and liberal democratic freedoms that are enjoyed by the West. They've seen these slowly being eroded over time by the Chinese Communist Party. Once the extradition bill was introduced that would allow people from Hong Kong to be extradited back to sit trial in mainland China. Once this extradition bill was introduced, a lot of these people saw that this firewall between the mainland and Hong Kong could potentially be eroded. Because what that would have meant was that mainland China could have potentially done up any kind of trumped up charges against somebody in Hong Kong, and then the Hong Kong government would be legally obliged to send that person back to mainland China to stand trial. And for a lot of people in Hong Kong, they really don't trust the legal system in the mainland. People of all ages, people of all backgrounds, people of all social classes who stood up to protest.
And this is interesting because what we're told is that these are a bunch of students, that these are student protests.
I would say it's not fully accurate. A lot, because of course, media being media, they like to show their audience things that are very, say, exciting or interesting or extreme. So a lot of the pictures that we see are these mainly young people on the front lines with their Molotov cocktails or their rocks or their sticks or their bamboo sticks, these very primitive weapons clashing with police. You, of course, have their tear gas and their batons, their rubber bullets, beanbags, water cannons, these types of things. But I would say that that type of protesting makes up maybe only about 10% of all of the other protests. The Hong Kong people, they're very creative, civilized, intelligent people. The vast, vast majority of the protests are peaceful protests, where people just gather very peacefully, they chant their slogans, they sing their songs, they do different creative things with art or these very unique ways of civil disobedience, which are 100% peaceful. So the extradition bill was introduced earlier in the year. There was lots of small, sporadic protests. But then there was one huge protest on June 9th. And at that protest, 1 million people came out to protest. And just to give you an idea of the scale, there's only 7 million people in Hong Kong in total. So 1 in 7 people took to the streets on June 9th and called on Carrie Lam, the Hong Kong chief executive, to withdraw this extradition bill. Carrie Lam said, no, we're still going ahead with the extradition bill, didn't want to hear from the people at all. And then the people, I feel, got very annoyed by this, that the government wasn't willing to listen to their demands. And then on June 12th, there was another huge protest. And at that one, 2 million people came out to protest, almost 1/3 of the Hong Kong population. And remember, Hong Kong is a very much divided city, like we just talked about. You have a lot of people who are pro-democracy, but you also have a lot of people who are pro-Beijing.
And we would also assume that even a lot of the people who do support the protesters are probably not going out and protesting themselves. One of the factors in that being that during the umbrella movement protests, the police went and arrested a lot of the protesters, 6 months after it started, right?
Sure, after the fact, yeah. Exactly. And so at this very large rally, you had a lot of the young people there dressed in all black, and they dressed with their face masks, really the kind of iconic images we know these protests to be. And when I asked a lot of them, why do you dress up like this? Why don't you show your face? Why are you all dressed the same? And they said for this particular reason, because after the umbrella movement, they trusted the government. They trusted the government would respect the right to assembly. But what started to happen was the police, after the fact, maybe 6 months later, 3 months later, continuing on, started to arrest people post facto, just pulling them from the street or pulling them from their homes, and started to, charge them. We had Benny Tai, of course, the organizer of the umbrella movement, the Occupy movement, was sentenced to prison. It's very hard to say exactly who started the violence, because I believe even on this first big protest on July 9th, the 1 million person protest, I believe the police did use pepper spray.
Put this in context. Now, the umbrella movement protests, this was like 20,000 people, something like that?
Sure.
Around that. And when the police used tear gas once, and it was a big deal.
Of course, we've seen now thousands and thousands, potentially tens of thousands of canisters of tear gas have been used in the last 6 months. And so really, this is where the violence started. It was kind of like an escalation of violence. And then from the big protest on July 12th, and it was very interesting, I was speaking to one of my team in Hong Kong. What he said was, if you have 2 million people turn out in a protest, even if you have a fraction of a % of them who are willing to resort to very violent methods to have their voice be heard in their own opinion, then potentially that could work out at thousands or tens of thousands of people who are willing to resort to some kind of violent acts. And so there are definitely acts of, you could say, violence from the protesters. They do have Molotov cocktails, they do have rocks, things like this that they throw, but the violence has very much been from both sides. The police have been much more able to inflict harm and violence on the protesters than it has been vice versa. These, again, to go back to your original question, they're only really a fraction of the overall protest and the overall resistance to this extradition bill and what has happened afterwards in the protests.
When it comes to the violence, I know there are a lot of Hong Kong protesters who believe the violence is being committed by Chinese agents or Hong Kong police wearing the clothes of protesters. And in China, this is not far-fetched. There have been many cases where Chinese agents or Chinese police have done this because they're a communist regime. During the 2008 Beijing Olympic protests, for example, there were Chinese riot police and agents holding the robes of Buddhist monks, Tibetan Buddhist monks. In other words, there was evidence and very plausible evidence, I should say, that the police were dressing as these protesters and committing acts of violence in order to justify a harsher crackdown. Now, based on your experience, because I know you witnessed quite a few of these protests, and you were, right in the middle of it, do you think these are plausible claims? Do you think this is what's happening, or do you think it's the protesters doing it?
The police have admitted that they've done this.
Okay, mystery solved.
The police have admitted that they've done it, and I've seen personally many cases myself. And these aren't just policemen who are dressing up as undercover policemen. There's lots of these, but these are policemen who are actually dressing up as protesters to infiltrate the protests and do whatever it is that they feel like doing. One of the events, you could say, that the media in Hong Kong used to kind of defame the protesters was one time when a group of people dressed like protesters destroyed an MTR station. They went in.
Metro station?
Yeah, like a metro station, exactly, like a subway station. But there was this very shocking video whereby one of the subway stations is closed down in the middle of the day for no particular reason. It's all closed down, and they do this from time to time when there are protests. But inside the subway station there was a policeman dressed up as a protester, and he was threatening the media outside of the shutter with pepper spray. And then why was that guy in there? Why was the subway station closed? Why was he in there? Why was he dressed like a protester? And of course the police will never admit that if they were to do something like, threatening the media with pepper spray. These make the situation in Hong Kong extremely challenging, particularly for a journalist. There's so much disinformation, there's so many rumors, there's so much misinformation.
With some of the images we also saw were these white shirt protesters they were like counter protesters, appearing to be grassroots, but I mean, look, part of my work at Epoch Times since like 2008 was investigating Chinese front operations, and I've done a lot of articles on that. And a lot of that led me to investigate different parts of the Chinese mafia, triads, tongs, that kind of stuff. Hong Kong and Taiwan, these guys are like the strong arm of the Chinese Communist Party. They'll go out and they'll put axes in the backs of journalists or beat up protesters. It's not uncommon.
Yeah, I think the incident you're referring to happened at a subway station in Yuen Long, and it was a particularly shocking incident that happened. So somewhere else in Hong Kong there were protests happening. I think some clashes between police, not in Yuen Long but somewhere else. The protesters were traveling back through the subway stations, the MTR stations. When they arrived in Yuen Long, they were met with, I don't know how many hundred they're called white shirts, they're triads from Yuen Long.
So they are triads?
They're triads, yeah, they're triads. The police who were in this subway station left. The two closest police stations to the Yuen Long incident closed down, shut their doors, they said for security reasons, and anybody who tried to phone the police hotline to report the incident, they just kept hanging up. These white shirts, they came into the subway station like a pack of wild animals. If you go onto Twitter or YouTube and watch the videos, like a pack of wild animals with sticks, with weapons, these types of things, and started to beat very, very severely women, men, these unarmed protesters, armed with maybe their umbrellas as they usually are. We have this politician, pro-Beijing politician, who was recorded after the incident, just nearby. Such a foolish move by him, but shaking hands with these white shirts.
Back when I was investigating these guys, actually, I was investigating their operations in New York. There were also Chinese embassy officials meeting with people who were committing acts of violence like this in Chinese communities. And they're not very smart. They blow the lid on their own operations by doing, they were going around shaking hands, congratulating them after they beat up people.
So for a lot of the people in Hong Kong, this was a real turning point, a real pivotal moment in the protest, because lots of people, I think, were shocked, really, really shocked by this attack.
Now, in the West, in the United States, when we hear of the police having police agents dress up as protesters and commit acts of violence, we're kind of shocked by it. Sure. When we hear of the government working with the mafia to beat people were shocked by it.
Sure.
But for Chinese people, they know that this is how the communist government operates because they've been doing it for years. And I'm not just saying that. If you read even news reports from these countries, it's very, very common knowledge that the Chinese government does this, the Chinese Communist Party does this. It's not like a secret. It's just common accepted fact that this stuff happens.
I think the most challenging thing for particularly a Western media looking at the Hong Kong situation is that the people behind these alleged incidents, they leave very little concrete evidence. It's not like they're very open with their data, but it's all kind of circumstantial evidence. You know, really, you can make theories, but the real challenging thing is actually pinning it on this. Take for example these white shirts. I don't think, how could it be possible to, you know, the police did close everything down, they did close a blind eye, they didn't answer the phone calls, but can we actually tie the police to it? It's impossible to do, very hard to do. But so many of these things have been happening in Hong Kong. I think what's very important to point out as well for anybody who mightn't be as familiar with Hong Kong isn't like other places in Asia where it's less developed. Hong Kong is like a very, very developed Western country with strong values, and the people have these very strong Confucian values, very reserved, very polite, very mannerly, very honest. You know, before these protests, Hong Kong was one of the safest places in the whole world, maybe the safest place in the whole world to be. For these things to happen, like being attacked by triads or, as you said, police dressing up as protesters or this type of thing, it's like it would be happening here in the US or in Britain or some of these very developed places. So it's very worrying, to say the least.
You know, of course, we see these images of violence. The Chinese regime's propaganda outlets have used it as an excuse to justify their actions against the people in Hong Kong. And we've also seen them roll out actual Chinese military troops, PLA troops, openly in Hong Kong, you know, doing their PT exercises and then going out and cleaning the city. They've used the image of violent protesters as a tool of propaganda. Now, I think we should talk about the military issue after this, actually. But first, I want to talk about how do the protesters themselves view the violence? And really, to what extent have protesters actually caused harm?
This is one of the questions that I often ask either the protesters in the front lines, who are mostly the young people, or the older people as well. I ask them this question, you know, how do you justify the violence? The answer I mainly hear is, you know, this is escalated. This is really escalated from the point where it was fully peaceful protest, like you imagine in a civilized country like Hong Kong, to the point where the protesters and the police began clashing. And of course, you'll have different stories about who was the catalyst behind that particular clash, but whenever these, you know, acts of aggression started between the police and the protesters, it's just escalated, 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 escalated. From police using pepper spray, to then police using tear gas, to then the police using rubber bullets and bean bags, and then of course they'll use their water cannons as well. There have been protesters who have died as a direct result of the protests, none from live ammunition, but a lot have fallen from high places because of tear gas or because of other things. But we have seen the police use live ammunition on a number of occasions. The two main justifications that the protesters give for the use of violence, and when I say violence, the protesters do things like they'll throw Molotov cocktails, they'll throw rocks, I saw them make a makeshift catapult out of a builder's helmet and two elastic bands. So they're very primitive. Apart from a few isolated incidents, very extreme incidents, they've never just wantonly attacked the public. You know, they do target things like pro-Beijing restaurants or pro-Beijing different things who are going against the protesters, who have some way affected the protesters. So what they'll say is we use the violence either as a way to defend ourselves against the police brutality, or they'll say this has escalated from us trying to get our message across peacefully. When they didn't listen to us, then we resorted to blocking the roads or this type of thing.
And notably too, they're known for, they'll block the roads if there was like an ambulance or something. They'll move
open it
everything
again.
and open
Sure,
it up. Yeah.
sure. I ask different people, even older people, you know, do you think that the violence is justified? And a lot of them will say that they feel it is. They personally feel it is. A lot of people will say, you know, we never condone any acts of violence. The Hong Kong people are very, very, in my experience, very nice, reserved, kind people. But they've been really driven, even the young protesters, it's very interesting on the front lines. When I speak to them, they're all very well educated, their ideas are very well founded. They talk to me about things like the concentration camps in Xinjiang, they talk to me about organ harvesting in mainland China, they talk to me about freedom of expression, freedom of speech, these types of things. They understand that these are the things they're fighting for. They did surveys, and most of them have third-level education. The vast, vast majority of them have third-level education or are pursuing it. They have this fighting spirit. They'll tell me, you know, we understand what's at stake and we're willing to give our lives for this thing. But they're afraid. I ask them, are you not afraid? They say, we are afraid. You know, of course we're afraid. You know, if these kids, these young protesters on the front lines get arrested, they face up to 10 years in prison. A lot of them have gone missing. You know, they understand that, you know, potentially anything could happen to them once they've been arrested. But they go out and do it anyway. But it's not their nature. It's not their true nature to go and do it. I can tell from speaking to them, they don't really want to be there. They prefer to be back at home. They prefer to be back at university with their friends, with their family. But they feel like they've almost been pushed to this brink. A lot of them say if we don't fight back now, we won't have a chance to ever fight back again. If you look at that extradition bill, they might have an argument for that. And so a lot of them have felt, a lot of them feel, from speaking with them, they feel that the end justifies the means to a certain extent. It didn't really look like the US was going to pass this Human Rights and Democracy Act anytime soon. And it wasn't until the clashes and the violence between protesters and police really, really grew. We saw at the universities and on the streets. It wasn't until this happened that then Marco Rubio pushed it through as an emergency piece of legislation. And this isn't to justify any of the violence, but it's just to kind of lead to your point about what they think of the violence. I don't think without these big clashes, I don't personally think that that bill would have been put through. And that bill that was passed by the US government was really, it really helped the pro-democracy protest.
It's been interesting. One of the issues we've really seen Republicans and Democrats come together on is China.
Sure.
And it's been encouraging to see, actually, because of course I've been reporting on this stuff for more than a decade, and I know it's a big deal, and I know it's the future of the world when it comes to China. The Chinese regime trying to push its form of government elsewhere, and something like this happening in their own backyard is a big deal. Sure. But getting back into, I think, two different directions I want to go in. One, I really want to talk about the Chinese military, but I think we should first talk about why are the protesters protesting? Now, we know that this, you know, we've talked about the extradition bill, but there's more to it.
It's not quite a simple situation. I see in lots of media, some people call them pro-democracy protesters. I also see some media outlets call them anti-government protesters. And we had a discussion in Hong Kong to see, well, what exactly are they? Because, you know, Hong Kong was handed back to China from the United Kingdom in 1997. Before that time, under British rule, they didn't have democracy either, but you didn't have these kind of protests, these very large-scale, intense protests. Now when I interview and I speak to people in Hong Kong about British rule, they really, you know, appreciated it. and a lot of them wish they could be ruled by Britain again. So I can't see that pro-democracy, it's not like these people look at these democratic countries and feel an envy towards them for what could you say, for this system of government, for democracy. So that doesn't fully encapsulate it. Anti-government also, I feel, doesn't fully encapsulate it, because the protesters have never asked for the dissolution of the Hong Kong government. It's more like a kind of freedom movement. They view it themselves as a freedom movement, because even when I kind of probe them, like, why do you want democracy? Why is it you want democracy? And they want it because of autonomy. More or less, the Chinese Communist Party will choose their overall leader, their chief executive. And the chief executive wields quite a lot of power in Hong Kong. And then the next branch of government down, the Legislative Council, the Hong Kong people argue is very much fixed or tends towards pro-Beijing lawmakers. And so they really feel that without the ability to choose their own leader, although they didn't have it under British rule, they trusted Britain to choose a leader that would have Hong Kong's best intentions at heart, but they don't trust the Chinese Communist Party to do the same. And really, these protests, it's not something that has just happened overnight like that. It did flare up because of the extradition bill, but we had the umbrella movement, we have lots of dissidents in Hong Kong, we have lots of outspoken critics of the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong, and we have lots of people in Hong Kong who have grown up with these liberal democratic values that they were given from Britain. And so you have people in Hong Kong who have tasted freedom. They understand what freedom is. And of course, because they're so close to the mainland, they know exactly what's happening there, like all the things I talked to you about, like Xinjiang, nobody has freedom of speech, these types of things. They understand the Chinese way of life. And they also understand that if they don't do something about it, this will become the Hong Kong way of life eventually. Once 2047 comes, Hong Kong loses its status as an independent entity from the mainland, and it's just fully...
And that was part of the original agreement when the British handed them over.
Exactly. And afterwards, Hong Kong just becomes another Chinese city. And so really, particularly the young people, they see that this protest and this resistance was going to come eventually anyway. And really, that's why I like to refer to it more like a freedom movement, rather than just an anti-this or anti-that movement. It's more that these people are fighting for what they see as a threat to their fundamental freedoms.
Now, if we look at the footage we've seen, these Chinese military, soldiers show up and they're in their PT uniforms and they're doing push-ups and whatever. And the Chinese Communist Party sends them out and they go and clean up the city, which is very bizarre. Of course, for guys like me, we've been covering the Chinese Communist Party for a long time. Like, okay, they're doing propaganda efforts. They're trying to paint the Chinese regime as, at least in my analysis, as being this peace bringer, the one trying to bring calm to the situation, the one caring about and cleaning up the city, of course. Now, first, is that your impression of what they were doing? And second, what was the significance, the real significance of them sending their military?
They do have these garrisons in certain places in Hong Kong, but what the law is in Hong Kong is that these PLA soldiers cannot be seen in public. They can only stay in their garrisons, and they're there for security reasons, national security reasons, or whatever reasons they're there for, but they're not allowed to actually come out in public. Just a couple of months back, they were sent out to clean up some of the wreckage from the clashes the night before. And of course, the different media were there. They took shots of these people coming with their, baskets and picking up rocks and tidying this and tidying that and running around. And then eventually they just ran home again. The point of it all was twofold. I think the first one, it was definitely used as a propaganda stunt to sway people's public opinion. Look, you have protesters over here and they're digging up the streets so they can barricade the roads, and then on this hand you have PLA soldiers who are coming out and they're cleaning it up and they're helping the community. Which side which side are you on, this type of thing. And these type of strong arm tactics I've seen quite a lot in Hong Kong is it was used to frighten the protesters, for sure. Not just the protesters, but anybody in this yellow community, this pro-democracy community. Basically, this is just my own theory on it, to show that, the PLA are only, 5 minutes away. They're right here. As quickly as they could go up to clean up the streets, they could come in and do what they did on Tiananmen Square. Something like this. From my observation, all of the propaganda stunts and really everything that the Chinese Communist Party or the Hong Kong government, whoever's responsible for it, has tried to do, has really backfired on them. I really feel that maybe they were trying to use the same tactics as they do in the mainland, to try and sway public opinion, the same types of propaganda. But the Hong Kong people were able to see right through it, like this PLA incident, for example. When I spoke to Hong Kong people about it in the following days, everybody saw it as a propaganda tactic. Nobody was swayed by it or emotionally moved by it. They saw it. They thought it was completely shocking that whoever sent them out could break the law. It's the law, they can't appear in public, break the law and then come out and try and run this propaganda stunt against the protesters. And after the US passed this Human Rights and Democracy Act, around the same time, in the same week, Hong Kong people also had the opportunity to express themselves through universal suffrage. Universal suffrage, of course, is everybody gets a vote and everybody's vote is equal. And this is one of the demands of the protesters. Hong Kong people don't have that to choose their leader. They don't have that to choose the people in the Legislative Council, but they do have it to choose their district councillors. District councillors have very little power. They're not lawmakers, but they act in a kind of advisory role. But with the district council elections, it's basically universal suffrage or true democracy. And so when the district council elections arrived, a lot of people saw it not as an opportunity to change laws or to have any effect overall, but they saw it as a kind of barometer of where do the Hong Kong people stand on the issue of the protests. Because in Hong Kong, you speak to the blue community, they'll tell you that they have a silent majority. The people who are pro-Beijing, they say most people in Hong Kong reject the protests or oppose the protests. And then you speak to the yellow community, the people who are pro-democracy, Hong Kong natives usually, they will tell you that we have the silent majority. That most people in Hong Kong, although they don't talk about it or shout about it, most people want democracy. They don't want this encroachment by the Chinese Communist Party. When this election came about, it was used as a barometer. Which way will the Hong Kong people vote in a type of de facto referendum? Will they vote to support the protesters or will they oppose them? 17 of the 18 councils went to pro-democracy parties or pro-democracy candidates. A huge, huge landslide for the pro-democracy team. After that happened and after the bill was passed in the US, I could see that the police started to take a much softer hand. Although the protesters were still doing the same things, they were still trying to block the roads, they were still trying to cause some protests to have their voices heard, this type of thing. But because the police didn't challenge them, because the police didn't agitate the situation, nothing happened, and the protesters eventually got tired and in the early hours of the morning just went home. Before these two events, the police would almost allow the protesters to start to come together and build up their barricades and build up their collection of Molotov cocktails and dig up the roads and do all of these things until there was hundreds or thousands of them, ready for this clash with the police. And then the police would come in and try and break it up. After these two big acts, the police, from what I could see, were much more proactive about not allowing these large-scale protests to build up. Not allowing big groups to build up and build up their Molotov cocktails or dig up the roads. They were almost preempting it and breaking it down. When I saw this, it was very strange. The first thing that it showed me was that it's actually the police who are in control of how the situation escalates. Because when they weren't there to escalate the situation, when they didn't agitate the protesters, nothing really happened, nothing significant. And then the second thing it showed me was, why didn't they take this strategy before? Why hadn't they taken this preemptive strategy before? And when I thought about it for a while, either the Hong Kong government or the Chinese Communist Party, they wanted the protest, they wanted to try and defame the protesters. They wanted to get the media shots, the video shots of them throwing Molotovs and with rocks and these types of things, so they could showcase this to the world. And they could say, look at these, which they did, look at these violent rioters. We need to do something about these violent rioters, and we have justification to do something about these violent rioters. And they tried to showcase this in mainland China, in Hong Kong, and internationally. You know, different media, even international media, were calling these things riots and rioters and focusing on the protesters' violence. When they realized that the Hong Kong people weren't misled and they voted in the pro-democracy camp's favor in a landslide, in a complete landslide, they realized this strategy, this propaganda strategy didn't work. It actually had the opposite effect. And when the US passed this Human Rights and Democracy Act, I really feel that at the same time they felt the same. This didn't work. Look at what's happened now. Now the US every year will assess Hong Kong's situation to see if it has enough autonomy, and they will then, you know, judge whether to give China and through Hong Kong these financial incentives, because Hong Kong is very important to China. It only accounts for a fraction of its GDP, its overall gross domestic product. I think 70% of the foreign direct investment for China comes through Hong Kong. So China needs Hong Kong to be independent, to get these special privileges as granted as a free country. And so when China realized, well, how this propaganda attempt to defame the protesters didn't just give us justification to do whatever we want, the people in the US weren't fooled by it. The people in the international community weren't fooled by it, and we've actually shot ourselves in the foot. So really what I saw was a lot of the propaganda attempts that were run against the protesters, they've actually failed very miserably, and has left the Chinese Communist Party or the Hong Kong government, whatever way you want to put it, with this very messy situation.
Roughly how many people are still protesting? Number one, I mean, in terms of scale. And number two, what are they still protesting for?
Again, these were two very pivotal moments, the Democracy Act and these elections in Hong Kong. I really felt that, okay, these protesters have got two big wins, and they were just off the back of some very, very intense protests where thousands of the frontline people were arrested. The Hong Kong government have withdrawn the extradition bill. What the whole protests were kicked off about, I believe in September, Carrie Lam finally, after months and months of protests, she withdrew the extradition bill. They got the win in the district council elections that really showed that most people in Hong Kong supported democracy, they didn't support Beijing, and they got the validation from the international community that we stand with you. I think now they'll go back to their original nature, you know, very reserved, we'll go back to work, you know, we'll go back to school, these types of things, and we'll just leave it. It's not what happened. They have really, really kept the pressure up because they have 4 more demands. You'll see the photos of the protesters, they hold up 5 fingers like this and they say 5 demands, not one less, 5 demands, not one less. The first demand is the extradition bill, withdraw the extradition bill. That was done. But they have 4 more demands that have happened after the fact. The first one is they want an independent investigation into alleged police brutality by the Hong Kong police. They want the designation of rioters and riots to be lifted because they don't feel themselves that they're rioting. They feel that they're, you know, exercising their right to assembly. In Hong Kong, if you're found guilty of rioting, this term of rioting, you could face up to 10 years in prison. If you're just somebody who's exercising the right to assembly, you don't have that. But because the Hong Kong government or the police have classified these as riots, it means that potentially anybody who's been involved in these protests could be arrested and face up to 10 years in prison.
Which is what happened after the umbrella movement protests.
Exactly. Then the other demands is they want amnesty for everybody who has been arrested during the protests. And then the 5th demand is that they want full universal suffrage to be implemented in Hong Kong, because this was part of the British Sino joint declaration, this handover agreement, was that gradually Hong Kong would be given the universal suffrage, given democracy to choose their own leader. They feel that without universal suffrage, then they can never truly be independent of the Beijing.
And so have the numbers dropped? Is it still like 1 million people out there?
The last huge rally was on International Human Rights Day, and at that rally it was estimated by the organizers that 800,000 people turned out. And for me it was quite shocking, because I didn't know if the Hong Kong people still had the fight and the desire to continue protesting for these extra demands. When I saw that parade, there was old people, there was young people, people of all backgrounds, you know, and of course you had the frontline protesters as well. Now there's still, I see videos now that have been back in New York, crazy things from the police, you know, at least from the short snippets of videos that I've seen since I've come back. The police have not let up at all. I saw that they pulled a gun at an event to stand in solidarity with the Uyghur Muslims, and there was a scuffle broke out, and the policeman again pulled out his revolver. He didn't shoot, but we're still at this very, very tense, yeah, still very high intensity.
I guess just last question, what do you think the significance is of Hong Kong? Why do you think, you know, we in America should care about it? Why do you think the rest of the world should care about it? What does Hong Kong mean for the rest of us?
When I speak with the kind of lawmakers and these barristers and these very educated people in Hong Kong, they all basically say the same thing, is that, you know, we have liberal democratic values. We're a free country and we enjoy these things. And communist China doesn't care. They just want to take over, you know, and they've infiltrated. You know, I've interviewed people in the media, I've interviewed people in politics, I've interviewed people in education, and they all say the same thing, is that communist China has been trying to subvert them by either overt means or covert means since 1997, potentially before then, but definitely since it's been handed back. And these people all warn of the same thing. It's that if this can happen in Hong Kong, then this can happen anywhere else. And of course we see that through your own reporting and your own investigative work. We see that in Australia and the US and all of the Western world, that these things are happening. But I think the kind of what Hong Kong can show us is a very advanced, a very refined version. Hong Kong is only 7 million people and the institutions are small. But for anybody who is interested in communist subversion, it's a very good case study. How have they done it? You know, what lengths have they gone to? How have the people fought back? These types of things. So I think the significance for the Western world is there. And then overall, I think it's hugely significant for the world in that it's a real thorn in China's side right now. China's problems, and a whole multitude of problems, economic, social problems, and even we saw when the protests in Hong Kong were going, other protests started to spring up in Guangdong, right, the closest province to Hong Kong, you know, for different reasons. And the Communist Party actually bowed to all of the demands of those protests in Maoming, in Guangdong, because I really feel that they couldn't have risked this disobedience or these kind of uprisings spreading to the rest of China. So I think really the Hong Kong people have done a great, they've put up a great fight, you know. It's a really David and Goliath battle there, and they haven't given up. And so I think overall, for anybody who is interested in China's future or communist China's future, I think it's really been a thorn in their side.
Great. Hey, Paul, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thanks, Josh.
Great. Everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. Hit that notification bell. See you next time.